Kia ora and welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to be focusing on a brief history of New Zealand, and in particular we will focus on the discovery and the settlement of Aotearoa. So New Zealand was thought to be settled by those who had travelled from East Polynesia before the 1100s. Research confirms that archaeological remains have been in New Zealand since 1280. The Polynesians who had travelled from East Polynesia became known as Māori and began to form a distinctive culture. The settlers then began to enjoy local hunting of large game, such as moa, and horticulture played a significant part in their early life. Kumara, taro, and cabbage began to flourish in the North Island, which was mainly due to the more favourable weathers. Those who had settled in the South Island lived largely off the land, where vegetation was already present. Settlers lived in what is called hunting bands. Hunting bands refers to a collection of people living together who share resources with one another. Sharing of resources with other hunting bands was required in order for all to have access to necessary survival items such as food. And although early settlers in Aotearoa did not live in harmony with other hunting bands, warfare was sporadic and any violence that occurred was infrequent. Apart from food and unnecessarily hunting tools, many hunting bands shared and bargained with one another without any bloodshed. One of the greatest achievements in Māori culture, which still occurs today, was carving tools necessary for ways of living. This could include waka, canoe, spears, knives, and buildings. By the time Aotearoa was first discovered by a European, the Māori had been living here for over 400 years. In 1642, Dutch explorer Abel Tasman arrived in his ships and moored them in the South Island in a place called Golden Bay. Fights began to occur between local Māori and Tasman's ship crew, which led to him moving his ship to the northern end of D'Urville Island. Excuse my pronunciation, it may not be D'Urville. Interestingly, Abel Tasman never left his ship, therefore he never set foot on any New Zealand land. Despite many plans to return, Tasman never made it back to Aotearoa, and it wasn't until many years later that Māori then met further European explorers. From 1770 to 1779, it is documented that James Cook travelled to Aotearoa 3 times, during which in his expeditions he moored at Ship Cove in Queen Charlotte Sound. It has been argued by various historians that Cook's instructions had been to cultivate a friendship and alliance with local Māori and iwi. Historians indicate that although small incidences occurred, which was mainly due to Cook's crewmen breaking sacred restrictions, the initial meetings were friendly and that Māori were welcoming of Cook and his crew. Other Europeans were also known to be mapping Aotearoa coastline with plans to visit. Ships from Spain, France, and other British colonies had heard of the land and the resources that were many and available. Throughout the 1700s, other explorers came to Aotearoa, many of whom who had contact with Māori. In particular, there was a French explorer, Marien du Fresne, who was eventually killed due to this conflict. Now, Marien du Fresne may not be the correct pronunciation either. So, although conflict did occur between European whalers, sealers, traders, missionaries, and adventurers in Aotearoa prior to the 1800s, it became more of an issue in the 1800s. Trading existed between Māori and the above, which was mostly for wood from trees. However, by 1830, over 100 European ships were visiting Aotearoa every year. What began to occur was lawlessness, many of which from sailors. Trading with guns and alcohol became more common. Māori chiefs then became concerned about the behaviour and the interaction of the whalers, sealers, and adventurers. Whilst this was also occurring, political concerns were developing. Māori and British were concerned that the French wanted to annex, which means to add territory to one's own territory, Aotearoa. 13 Māori chiefs then petitioned King William to provide protection. While this was occurring, in Britain, humanitarians also began to petition to save Māori from the same treatment of other indigenous cultures, in particular Africa, Australia, and the Pacific. James Busby was then appointed the first British resident in New Zealand. At this time, which is 1830s onwards, Māori were often trading with New South Wales, Australia, who had large ships. However, the issue is that Aotearoa New Zealand as a nation did not exist. Under British maritime law, in order to trade, a ship was required to A, have a flag, and B, a ship's register. With no official authorization, James Busby then developed the Declaration of Independence, which was signed by 34 Northern chiefs. The document then travelled throughout the country and other chiefs began to sign. The Declaration of Independence was meant to acknowledge Māori identity and prevent other countries to trade with Māori. The local Māori interpreted this document as a guarantee of independence. Busby and other British officials see it as a step towards making Aotearoa a British possession. The British King then acknowledged this declaration in 1836. It is also important to be aware that in 1787, New South Wales, Australia was an established colony. The colony of New South Wales also included many islands in the Pacific Ocean, including the North Island of New Zealand and the southern half of the South Island. Despite the declaration being signed, lawlessness continues throughout Aotearoa. Whalers, sealers, adventurers, and traders began to settle in this country. Many convicts from Australia were also beginning to arrive. In 1839, the New Zealand Company disclosed its plans to establish colonies in Aotearoa. Captain William Hobson was then sent to New Zealand to explore the concerns of lawlessness and encourage Māori to cede, which is to give up, sovereignty to the British. In 1839, the Governor of New South Wales, George Gipps, was then appointed the Governor of New Zealand, which to many this was a clear indication of the British intent to annex Aotearoa. On February 6, 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed by William Hobson and approximately 40 chiefs. Copies of the treaty then travelled throughout the country and over 500 chiefs signed the document. However, a large number refused to do so. So although that is a very brief history for you all, there are recommended readings, one of which is the Treaty of Waitangi by Claudia Orange. Now there are several editions, however any edition will do. And the other book recommended, in particular for Module 1, is The Penguin History of New Zealand, which is by Michael King. This is also available as an e-book, therefore if you have an e-reader or a Kindle, it may be cheaper, but it also might be worth checking out the notice boards and also Trade Me.